Okay, in this episode, in our Introduction to Apologetics series, we begin our look at the historical case that can be made for the resurrection of Jesus. Now, recall that in this series, we've been following the classical method of doing apologetics, which involves three sequential stages. In the first stage, we dealt with some issues related to philosophical foundations. In the second stage, we reviewed some of the classical and contemporary arguments for the existence of God. We're currently focused on the third stage in this classical method, as we've been considering evidence in support of the claim that Christianity is the true form of theism. Recall also that when it comes to the truth of Christianity, everything depends on Jesus Christ. If Jesus is who he said he is, then Christianity is true. If he was not who he said he was, well, then Christianity is false. Although Jesus performed many signs in support of his claims, the final validation of his claims was his resurrection from the dead. And as we have elsewhere noted, since Christianity stands or falls with Christ, and since the claims of Christ finally rest on his resurrection, it can be said that Christianity itself rises or falls with the resurrection. Of course, the primary witness to the resurrection of Jesus Christ is the collection of first-century documents that were eventually assembled together into a book we now call the New Testament. Over the previous several episodes, we reviewed the basic case for thinking that the New Testament provides us with a historically reliable and trustworthy account of the life, ministry, death, and the resurrection of Jesus. Now, obviously, if the New Testament is a historically trustworthy account of Christ, and as we've seen, it is, then it's reasonable to believe that Jesus did, in fact, do what he claimed he would do. That is, he rose from the dead, and that he therefore was, in fact, who he claimed to be. That is, the Son of God incarnate. So one way to argue for the resurrection of Jesus, and thus for the truth of Christianity, is to establish the historical credibility of the documents that bear witness to the risen Jesus. We can call this approach to arguing for the truth of Christian theism the top-down method. The strategy here is straightforward. Simply show that the sources of information about Jesus are credible. If we have credible sources, then we have good reason to believe what they tell us. There is, however, another way to argue for the truth of Christian theism that is even more straightforward. Rather than arguing that the New Testament as a source is historically credible and trustworthy, we can instead make a specific case for the resurrection of Jesus directly by working from a small collection of independently attested and strongly evidenced historical facts. In other words, we can completely sidestep the question of the historical credibility of the New Testament as a source in general, or the credibility of the Gospels as sources in particular. And we can just instead focus on the resurrection of Jesus as a historical event. And remember, if Jesus rose from the dead, this fact alone would verify Christianity. So we can call this approach to arguing for the truth of Christian theism the bottom-up method. I call it bottom-up because it attempts to build a case for the resurrection of Jesus from some independent and strongly attested historical data. So instead of establishing the credibility of certain sources, we'll be looking at specific historical data points that will serve as evidence in support of the fact that Jesus actually did rise from the grave. Of course, what I'm calling the top-down and bottom-up methods are not mutually exclusive. They can, and I think they should be combined to form a cumulative case for Christian theism. In other words, these methods represent two distinct routes to the same destination. So what does a bottom-up historical argument for the resurrection of Jesus look like? Well, as with all arguments for some historical hypothesis, the case for the resurrection of Jesus will be in the form of an inductive argument generally, and more specifically, in the form of an inference to the best explanation, which is also sometimes called abductive reasoning. In this form of argumentation, we first begin with the evidence or the historical facts that are available to us, and then we infer what is the most probable, most likely, or best explanation for that evidence or for the historical facts that are available to us. Accordingly, our historical case for the resurrection of Jesus will unfold in 2 steps. The first step is to establish the strongly attested facts that will serve as the historical evidence. The second step is to show that the resurrection of Jesus is the best or most probable explanation for the facts, over and against rival hypotheses. Let's consider the second step first. How does one go about evaluating rival hypotheses which attempt to account for some set of historical facts? Well, historians weigh the relative strength of alternative historical theories or explanations by measuring them against several key factors. Now, some of the most important of these factors are explanatory power, which measures how well a historical theory explains or accounts for the available facts. There's explanatory scope, which measures how many of the available facts are explained or accounted for by a historical theory. Then, of course, there's plausibility, which is just a measure of how reasonable a historical theory is. And then the degree of ad hocness measures how contrived a historical theory is. A historical hypothesis that measures up well against these factors and that measures up to them better than the available rival hypotheses is likely to be true. And as we'll see, the resurrection of Jesus provides the best explanation and best accounts for the relevant historical facts. So what about the first step? How do we go about identifying the historical facts that will serve as evidence for a historical case for the resurrection of Jesus? Well, here we should be in familiar territory because if you've been following along in this series of episodes, you'll recall that there are certain criteria that are employed by historians to determine the credibility of reported events. These criteria function as guiding principles for assessing accounts from the past and for finding historical bedrock. Now, since we've already looked at some of these criteria in a previous episode, I'll just list them here. Accounts of historical events gain credibility when they are reported early, when they have multiple independent attestation, when they are reported in multiple forms, when they contain embarrassing testimony, when they are attested to by hostile or disinterested parties, and when they cohere with a known historical context. All of the historical facts that we will appeal to in our case for the resurrection of Jesus will be strongly attested. They will be facts that meet the criteria for historical credibility. Because they are so well attested historically, the facts we'll be using as our evidence for the resurrection of Jesus enjoy widespread acceptance by the relevant scholars and historians. In other words, they are facts that are granted by the vast majority of scholars who study the subject. Now, it's not my intent here to intentionally follow a minimum facts approach to arguing for the resurrection of Jesus as developed by scholar Gary Habermas. In Habermas's popular minimal facts approach, he considers only those data that are so strongly attested historically that they are granted by nearly every scholar, including the skeptical ones, who studies the subject. Habermas's strategy is to use the lowest common denominator of agreed upon facts as evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. The minimal facts approach considers only data that meet 2 criteria. First, the data are strongly evidenced. And second, the data are granted by virtually all scholars on the subject, even the skeptical ones. Although I think that this is a fine strategy, in my own presentation of the basic case for the resurrection of Jesus, I'll be focused only on the first of these criteria, that the facts that we're going to be looking at need to be strongly evidenced historically. So, although several of the facts that I'll be presenting are, in fact, acknowledged by virtually every scholar who studies the subject, I'll also be appealing to a fact or two that, although widely acknowledged as historical by a strong majority of scholars, nevertheless may fall short of the kind of virtual unanimity among scholars that some of the other facts enjoy. All right, so much for stage setting and the making of distinctions. In the next episode in this Introduction to Apologetics series, we're going to take a look at these strongly attested facts that will end up serving as the evidence in our historical case for the resurrection of Jesus.